Welcome back to Men and the City. In today's video, we are going to talk about the return of kings. And before I delve into that, I want to introduce a concept that I think is going to set the stage for this discussion. It's called the state of exception. And I'm going to reference that within the context of a book by the same name, written by an Italian philosopher named Giorgio Agamben. And the state of exception essentially is an emergency. But let's use his words, and then we'll build on this theme from there. So according to Agamben, the state of exception is the no man's land between public law and political fact. It is the threshold of interdeterminacy between democracy and absolutism. Really, the way I want you to think about it is a transition. So on this channel, I've talked at length about a transition from the age of prosperity to the age of scarcity. Well, in a political sense, think about that as the state of exception. The end, you might say, of the normal procedure of government because of a critical mass of crises that government can't deal with. And I don't just mean the United States government. I also mean Western governments and presumably governments around the world that are all trying to tackle an acute crisis, a crisis that's socioeconomic, that's financial, that may be about the sovereignty or the national identity of the population itself. All of these problems are beginning to mount and mount and mount. Well, part of the backdrop for this discussion is an overload on governments around the world. And I'm going to start the clock on that overload about 20 years ago. But you could start it before then if you wanted to. But 20 years ago, when the global war on terrorism began, governments around the world adopted or absorbed tremendous power. In the United States, that was largely because of the Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act granted tremendous surveillance power in the hands of the state that was unprecedented. And of course, the pretext for that was the global war on terrorism. The next expansion of government power came in 2008 with bailouts that by many accounts were unconstitutional. Essentially, the government stepped in to buy up huge amount of private debts that weren't liquidated or weren't purged from the system, but were just shifted to public balance sheets. And of course, we're dealing with that problem more so today than we were even then. And that's a subject I'll explore in later videos. But if you accept the pretext, that is the global war on terrorism, and then the bailouts in 2008, and more recently, the onset of a public health crisis, which is COVID, all of these have layered on top of layers more and more responsibility, financial, economic, military, whatever, on the government ledger. And this has led to a very dangerous situation that we live in today. And all along the road to getting here, you've seen a gradual discontent emerge with the expansion of that government power. You've seen it in the Tea Party movement, which emerged in the aftermath of the government bailouts in 2008. Similarly, you had the emergence of Occupy Wall Street, which for its day was a very powerful movement that spread in various cities across the United States and indeed beyond its borders. More recently, you've seen Black Lives Matter and you've seen Antifa. In France, you've seen the Yellow Vest movements, and you've seen various protest movements like that in the UK, in Germany, and elsewhere. Well, what this is telling you is that we're headed for this transitional point in which the rule of law, the normal procedures of government, are simply no longer up to the task of handling these problems. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the state of exception. Now, the ancients were, in a sense, more wise than we were in this regard. They understood that democracy, in particular, was not self-correcting. And as a result, they built into their constitutional framework or their system of government a condition that allowed for those circumstances where democracy simply couldn't address an existential crisis. The Romans called it senatus consultum ultimum. And what that meant was that they essentially suspended the governance of the Senate, which was responsible for maintaining authority over society under normal circumstances. And in lieu of that, they empowered two men, A proconsul that held power in Rome and governed the state administratively, and a proconsul that ruled the army to deal with or crush or fend off whatever the invading army or whatever the existential crisis happened to be at that time. Well, what I'm suggesting to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that we're headed into a similar environment in which you're going to see a kind of power vacuum emerge, if for no other reason that we have such a convergence of crises overwhelming the authorities' ability to deal with that. Well, what's the resolution to that conflict? This brings us back to the state of exception. Now, in the last video that we talked about sexless men and war brides and a lot of dynamics that are undermining the stability of the social system that we live in. In a similar vein, I want to reference Prigozhin. Prigozhin was a chemist that talked about the relationship between order and disorder, or order and chaos. And remember, in the last video, we said that order does not necessarily emerge in spite of chaos or in spite of he called it entropy, but because of it. So this power vacuum will necessitate a reorderliness. And the mechanism by which that happens, ladies and gentlemen, is a king, the return of kings. Now, the word king itself is an interesting word because its etymology is derived from kin, and kin means the people. So you will start to see the emergence of king-like figures who will concentrate power vested in the people or in the population to solve this problem. And Agamben in particular said that the sovereign is he who resolves the state of exception. Think about that for a moment. Now, in order for a king to acquire power, even in a modern framework, requires a mass movement. And that mass movement will be the subject for the next video in this series. So stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.